In this very brief uh, presentation, narrated PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to just quickly review the whole concept of online webinars. To be honest with you, this is one of the most exciting developments when it comes to audiology education that I've ever witnessed in my 40-year career. So in this very brief, maybe 10-minute presentation, I'm going to address these topics. What is a webinar? What are the webinar platforms that you might use for this type of education? What are the advantages of online webinars? And then I'm going to get on to some of the topics that I've already given webinars on over the years, and I'll finish up by providing a few ideas for customized topics for online webinars that you might want me to give. Now, I'll point out that this is a very common way of conducting educational activities at all levels, from high school and probably even younger, all the way up through college, and it's great for continuing education. So let me just get right into it as quickly as possible. A webinar is basically a PowerPoint presentation, just like you've all heard, you've all listened to, and it's live, except the person giving the presentation is in a different location than the people listening to the presentation. So the presenter, let's say it's me, obviously, that's what I'm talking about here, I could be anywhere. All I need is a good laptop, and I need internet access. And I also have, right now, in fact, I'm using a very high quality Logitech headset. So it's got a very good microphone and earphones. It's mostly the microphone that we're interested in. So when you listen to a webinar, it's just like the person who's giving the webinar, presenting, is right in front of you. The audio is crystal clear. Now, I typically do not use a video component. I don't think most of the people listening to me really want to see me, although I might do that at the very beginning, kind of make it more like I'm right in front of the people, or I'll put up a photograph. But that can be done. But mostly it's the audio and it's the information that's in the PowerPoint presentation itself. So all I need is the computer and the headset and internet access. I've literally given webinars from anywhere in the world. I've given them from England to people in the United States. I've given them in the United States to people in South Africa and England. And so there's no limit geographically, except, obviously, if it's a live webinar, we have to pick a time that's convenient for both me and particularly for the attendees. Now, I'm a little more flexible. So I've given webinars, for example, to audiologists and audiology students in India, where I really had to start the webinar at 11 in the evening for the people in India to listen to me at 9 in the morning. But certainly anywhere in the United States, we can arrange easily to schedule the webinar, maybe during a lunch hour, when everybody at a clinic it can be free. So I'm anywhere. In the summer months, I'm almost always at our little place on the coast of Maine. Here, my wife and I are hiking on Monhegan Island, which is it's called the Mid-Coast. It's about of Maine. It's about an hour and a half north of Portland. And then in the winter months, I'm almost always in my study here, right where I am now, in St. Augustine, Florida. Now you, the audiologist listening, could be listening individually, all in front of their laptops, wherever they might be, including home, or all the audiologists could be in a conference room, say in a clinic or in a hospital, or the attendees might be AUD students or AUD externs, and they might all be in one room watching the same TV, listening to my voice, and of course there'd be microphones in the room where I could hear the students in case they had questions. So that's pretty much what a webinar is. Now, in recent years, certainly within the last 10 years, all kinds of platforms have been developed for this kind of education. Many of you are familiar with Blackboard. It's used by many universities. Now there's Canvas, there's Adobe Connect. Any of those could be used. And then there are some commercial program platforms that people use for conferences, remote conferences, for people who are for example, working at home, but they, once a day or periodically they get together with their colleagues, wherever their colleagues might be. So here are some of them that I've used, mostly when I've done webinars. The people organizing it have gone with either WebEx or Zoom, but there are many others. There are at least 10 or 12 of these. And so basically, some people already have a subscription to it. If you're at a hospital or a university, my guess is they already subscribe or basically have a contract with one of these companies, so you just tap into it. Most people get a password for the day, or maybe don't even need one for a certain period of time. And basically, again, all you need is a computer, access to the internet, and you really want to have a good microphone to speak, although you can use the computer microphone and the computer speaker. Now, I'm going to next talk about the advantages of online webinars, but obviously one big advantage is the access to software now that allows you to do it. Now, when I give webinars, I don't make those arrangements. I leave it to the people who are sponsoring the webinar or organizing it to make those arrangements. So I'll usually get an email saying, here's your WebEx invitation, here's a password if you need it, and then I just log on. Usually I'll get together with the organizers, the people that are putting together the webinar. Let's say the head audiologist in a clinic, or one of the representatives of a manufacturer, maybe an international representative. So they send me an invitation, and usually we do a dry run sometime 2 or 3 days beforehand, make sure everything's working smoothly. And then I just log on about 15 minutes before the scheduled time of the webinar, and away we go. I've done a lot of webinars for Audiology Online. If you want to see any of them, you can certainly go to Audiology Online and check them out. So what are the advantages of online webinars? Well, there are numerous advantages, but maybe the biggest is the whole issue of inexpensive, the inexpensive nature of the webinar, the saving of many costs. This photograph that you see here was taken of me in the middle. I always wear a tie so I can be distinguished from everybody else in terms of I'm the presenter and they're listening. But this is in the Philippines. And when I was invited to speak in the Philippines in 2018, it was in early 2018, March. I looked at the program. I couldn't believe it. The organizers of this big otolaryngology audiology meeting wanted me to fly to the Philippines to give two 15-minute talks. And I thought, my gosh, this is crazy. I'm flying literally halfway around the world. It's going to take me a good day and a half to get there, day and a half to get back, and all of this expense and all of this time for two 15-minute lectures. So I actually made some contacts with some equipment manufacturers and some audiologists I know, and I ended up giving a day and a half worth of workshops while I was there. So at least it made my trip worthwhile. But with a webinar concept, everybody that's in this photograph, all of these audiologists in the Philippines and audiology students, they could have been in that very same room, and I could have been beamed into them, teleconferenced in, at a good time for them. That might not be a good time for me, and they would have heard my voice, they would have seen my face, they could have asked me questions, and the experience really would have been pretty much the same. Now, the only downside of online webinars is it's not as easy for me to do hands-on demonstrations and activities. So in this workshop in the Philippines, I actually hooked somebody up and we performed some ABRs. We did some fancy tympanometry and acoustic reflexes. We did some OAEs. But even that can be done, believe it or not, through the internet. I could easily take over a OAE device if need be and actually demonstrate something while I was in a remote location. So here are just some of the advantages. I've got a little graphic art there showing somebody squeezing the life out of some money, and that's it. Saving money is the big advantage. So I don't have to travel. I don't have to leave home. No, the attendees don't have to travel. They basically are going to be at work or at home where they would be anyway. So there's no travel expenses, no hotel, no airfare, no ground transportation. And I charge $500 per hour for the webinar. So that includes all my preparation. And usually there will be questions and answers, not just during the webinar, but after the webinar via email or maybe very often the head audiologist, the director, collates or compiles all the questions from the people working in the clinic, the audiologist or students, and then they are sent to me and I give a response. So, for 500 an hour or $1,000 for 2 hours, that's the only cost for the webinar. So it's very time efficient, very convenient for everybody involved, me and you, and convenient. It couldn't get more convenient. Basically, say where do you want to do the webinar? It can be done like I said, in a lunch hour. It could be done after hours if the clinic's too busy, or it could be done in a designated time, say noon hour during the clinic. It is live. That's a big advantage. So that means that there can be an exchange of ideas. Students or attendees, whoever it is, can be asking questions as we go or at the end. I'll make it entertaining, I'll make it engaging, make it maybe even inspiring, getting people to do things that they normally wouldn't do. Very often, in fact, while we're on that topic, a director of audiology, I've been a director of audiology for 30 years. I'm not now, but I was. And one of my jobs was to make sure that everybody in the clinic was excited about what they were doing, and the morale was good. And when I said let's study this topic, or let's start using this new protocol on these patients, or we need to really revamp our protocol now that the new Joint Committee statement is out, or now that we know about auditory neuropathy, I wanted to make sure everybody was excited about these new ideas. And so that's one of my abilities. I'm usually able to get people excited about things. So the director of a clinic might say, boy, we're having a hard time getting everybody to use recorded speech materials, or to screen for APD, or to use OAEs when they're supposed to. And so I can come in and I can kind of get everybody on board. And very often, there's an expression about a prophet's always, somebody from some other town that usually used to be, that carries a carousel of slides. But in any event, I can often help a clinic director or an instructor or a professor with their whatever they're trying to instill or incorporate into their clinic. And so there's plenty of opportunity for questions and answers. And another big advantage of webinars, as opposed to just a live presentation, is that it's very easy to record them. And I do that at the very beginning of the webinar. All I have to do is press record, and that's almost always an option. And then you save this file that's basically a PowerPoint presentation with my voice, and then people can go back later and review it, or if somebody's sick that day or not at work, they can listen to it just like everybody else did, except it won't be live. And of course, I always provide a copy of my presentation, a handout, before, so people can review, and then after. Now, I have a number of topics that are ready to go. I mean, literally, if someone called me and said, can we do a webinar tomorrow? If I were available, and if everybody else were available, we could do it. And these are all webinars of 1 or 2 hours. You certainly can do more. I mentioned this webinar I did in India, where I was presenting, and everybody was, half a world away, and that was 3 hours. So there's no real limit. What I normally do, if it's more than an hour, is we would schedule maybe a 5-minute break after every hour, so people could stretch and use the restroom, etc. So these are topics that I've given webinars on in the past, and I always update them. One of my principles is I always update every presentation before I give that presentation. Even if I just gave it a month or two before, I always get online, I do a PubMed search, I review the literature, and I incorporate any new information, any new technological development. If I'm giving a webinar for a manufacturer, which I've done, I've given webinars for a variety of manufacturers, then obviously they're the ones that are supporting it, sponsoring it. I'll usually say, I'm going to be giving a webinar on middle ear measurements. Why don't you send me photographs of your middle ear devices? If I'm going to show a middle ear device, I might as well show the manufacturer who's sponsoring the webinar. But I don't work for any manufacturer. I'm not a consultant for any manufacturer. All through my career, I've been academically independent. I practice evidence-based audiology, and my lectures are all evidence-based, and they're not corporate type lectures. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not what I do. So I may show equipment from one manufacturer, but I'm talking about technology and techniques that are generic, that any audiologist can relate to. So here's some of the topics. I've given many live lectures and webinars on medical errors for audiologists to avoid. We talk about everything from privacy and security of patients to avoiding malpractice, reducing professional liability, how you can instill systemic policies in your clinic so that people are doing the best to help patients and not hurt them. I've got several lectures on best practices in diagnostic audiology. It's a very popular topic for me. I've given lectures to VA audiologists, university audiologists, clinical audiologists of all types, and I always update that, including the reference to recent clinical practice guidelines. And I talk a lot about how to assess patients diagnostically very efficiently, getting the most out of the limited time that you have. I've got plenty of webinars on various aspects of OAEs, but my typical webinar, and I've done this for several manufacturers as well as Audiology Online, talks about just very basic clinically practical information on how do you measure OAEs, how do you analyze them, and how do you get the most out of them in the clinic. Same thing with middle ear measurements. I've got a 1 or 2 hour webinar that I talk about tympanometry, high frequency tympanometry, eustachian tube tests, acoustic reflex measurements such as threshold, latency, amplitude, decay. And then I also have a special lecture, which I love to give, 1 hour on acoustic reflexes, just focusing on their diagnostic value and how to use them in clinic on almost every patient. Obviously, I'm known for my work in auditory evoked responses. I use my books for my webinars. I can talk about any auditory evoked response in a very practical clinical way, from ECOG to ABR, tone burst ABR, chirp ABR, cortical evoked responses from middle latency to the late to the P300. And of course, if you are a manufacturer's representative asking me to give a webinar, then as I said earlier, I'll focus on whatever equipment you wish me to use as an example of how to record auditory evoked responses. And then I also have webinars that are ready to go on any topic that you see here. Now, one of my policies is I never give lectures on topics that I don't know something about. If I'm not an expert on the topic, I just won't talk about it. So I don't give lectures on hearing aids. I don't give lectures on vestibular assessment. Don't give lectures on cochlear implants. Those are areas, and I do talk about topics related, such as which patients might benefit from hearing aids based on the diagnostic assessment, or how hearing aids can be used as a treatment option in patients with tinnitus, or how FM devices can be used as treatment for auditory processing disorders. But I don't speak specifically about those three topics: hearing aids, vestibular assessment, and rehabilitation, and also cochlear implants. But I do talk about the evidence-based assessment and management of APD in both children and adults. Certainly I can modify the lecture so it's only involving children or only adults. The same thing, evidence-based assessment and management of tinnitus. I've got a very, very practical approach to evaluating patients with tinnitus, and my whole theme is that any audiologist should be providing tinnitus services to 80%, or at least, of all the patients with tinnitus, even bothersome tinnitus, that come through the clinic. Elsewhere on my website, I've actually got some narrated PowerPoint presentations on both APD and tinnitus. You may want to check those out. And then, of course, I either as part of my ECOG lecture or separately, I can talk about auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder. So these are all topics. I don't want to constrain your thinking about the topics, but if you any variation of any of these topics, I've got a webinar all ready to go. And now I'd like to talk about customized topics, where we're going to wrap this up now. It'll be about 20 minutes. And what you see here is a slide showing me giving just a little kind of a seminar type series of lectures, all one day, in Bogota, Colombia. Now, I was speaking in English. I don't speak enough Spanish to give a lecture. But basically, this is what we're replicating with a webinar. So instead of me standing there, having flown to Colombia and staying in a hotel and getting to the university where this was held, the 5 or 6 audiologists in this clinic where I was speaking, where I was giving very detailed lectures on various topics, electrophysiology, OAEs, middle ear measurements. Imagine instead they're all in the same room, but I'm not standing in front of them. I'm sitting in my study here in St. Augustine, Florida, or in my study up in Maine. And so otherwise it's exactly the same. So what are some of these topics that you might think about? Well, this is just a few I put together very, very quickly. So I'm sitting in that chair, which you see in this slide, but it's actually facing the chair right as you're looking at it is facing my desk, my grandfather's old desk when he retired as bank president, worked his way up from teller. George Stanley Shaw was his name. He got this as a retirement present, the desk I sit at. And my back is to, and what the students are seeing is they're looking from the computer toward me. In back of me is my study bookshelves, as you can see there. So this is basically the setup. And I can customize any topic listed here for your clinic. So I can review clinic protocols. Those are fun webinars to do. So you send me the protocols in the clinic, I review them, and then we discuss them and we update them and we make sure they're evidence-based. Or I might focus on counseling. How do you counsel a patient with bothersome tinnitus? How do you counsel the parents of a child with APD? How do you counsel parents of a child uh, um, has just been diagnosed with a severe hearing loss, and you've just finished the ABR and confirmed that hearing loss? How do you counsel those parents? And we got obviously other um, types of patients that we could talk about. I also can give webinars. I teach entire classes on very advanced diagnostic audiology where we get into clinical decision making. And so here in a webinar, I might be asking a lot of questions. We might be going through some cases where the people in the webinar, the attendees, they may be students, they may be audiologists, present cases, and then we discuss the cases. Or let's say you want to expand your clinical programs to include tinnitus and decreased sound tolerance patients or APD patients, or you want to expand in some other way. I can help you with that. I directed clinics for 20 years, and we were always introducing the latest techniques, intraoperative monitoring, electroneuronography, you name it. I've got lectures that I could easily convert to webinars on ototoxicity assessment and monitoring, where we talk about everything from the mechanisms to guidelines for how you should do this. Lately, I've given some lectures on how do you get AUD students to start using best practices during their education so that habit or that practice will carry over into their, when they're working in the clinical setting independently. I've talked a lot about audiology applications of telehealth, which we sometimes call teleaudiology. I can certainly give a lecture on ENOG, electroneuronography, intraoperative monitoring. These are kind of specialized topics. So in 1 hour, you can cover quite a bit of the material. I've got some exciting lectures on future of audiology. Actually, I've given that online webinar around the world. Really an upbeat, this is the kind of pep talk type lecture where people who are discouraged about the future of audiology realize they've got incredible opportunities now to shape that future and maybe to have a better audiological career than the rest of us had in the years past. And then just to wrap up my little introduction lecture here, it's going to be more like 25 minutes. I've been talking quite a bit lately and researching and writing about promoting healthy hearing over the lifespan. How can we prevent, another way to talk about that is preventive audiology. So how do you minimize, mitigate, or even perhaps prevent hearing loss in a patient that you're working with over years? And many ways of doing this. Healthy lifestyles, healthy diet translate into healthy hearing. So I have a nice little 1 or 2 hour lecture on that. And the same with comorbidities and hearing loss. Hearing loss often does not occur in isolation. It may occur with another sensory deficit, like, for example, vision loss, a dual sensory deficit, or with other problems such as diabetes or obesity, or some systemic problem, rheumatoid arthritis. So I've got a whole lecture on that topic. Well, if you've taken the time to listen to my little spiel, I hope that you've come away saying, hey, this is a really interesting option for educating audiologists. It's inexpensive, can be done quickly. Can be done. You could do a series of online webinars. I've done that too, where you plan it all out, 2 or 3 of them ahead of time. The dates are all set up, the topics are all set up, and they all kind of run from one into the other. So if you have any questions about these, or certainly if you want to schedule an online webinar, just contact me by email or telephone. You have my information elsewhere on this website. And I hope to hear from you. Thank you very much.